Thank you, Scott. All right, so I have the honor of introducing our keynote, Elizabeth Losh. She is the author of Virtual Politic, an electronic history of government media making in a time of war, scandal, disaster, miscommunication, and mistakes, from MIT Press 2009, as well as The War on Learning, Gaining Ground in the Digital University, also from MIT Press 2014. She is the co-author of the comic book textbook and my favorite textbook, Understanding Rhetoric, a Graphic Guide to Writing, with Jonathan Alexander. She is currently working on a new monograph tentatively entitled Obama Online, Technology, Masculinity, and Democracy. She writes about gender and technology, the digital humanities, distance learning, connected learning, media literacy, and the rhetoric surrounding regulatory attempts to limit everyday digital practices. She is the director of the Culture, Art, and Technology program at 6th College at UC San Diego, where she teaches courses on digital rhetoric and new media. She is also a blogger for Digital Media and Learning Central and a steering committee member for Haystack and FemTechNet. Please join me in welcoming Liz Losh.
Many thanks to Lydia, to Scott, and to Justin. And let me find my, okay, that looks right. Aren't you glad to know that we all know so much about technology? All right, I didn't knock out the live streaming with that, did I? So I'm delighted to be at this groundbreaking assembly devoted to the topic of digital rhetoric, with an extraordinary group of scholars from whom I've learned much over the years. As many of you may know, I gave up ownership of the web domain digitalrhetoric.org years ago because it seemed ridiculous to try to claim such a vibrant and contentious field as my own personal intellectual fiefdom. And I do look back with some amusement at my own self-importance when considering my strenuous efforts to define digital rhetoric as a term of academic art in my first book, in which the entire second chapter was devoted to an argument of definition and identifying the gradations between our lived experiences of digital rhetoric as participants in our contemporary life worlds, and digital rhetoric as the ideological structure of procedural systems that are often invisible in daily use. As my former colleague Steve Mayu used to say, it's interpretation all the way down, rhetoric all around, and ideology here, there, and everywhere. So about a decade ago, when I was researching that first digital rhetoric book, I tried to figure out where the term digital rhetoric actually came from. I had traced it back to 1992 in Richard Lanham's essay, Digital Rhetoric and the Digital Arts, but I've always been suspicious of solo white male inventor myths. This really happened. So I thought I would take Lanham out to lunch and interrogate him about who was using the term and when and how, on the assumption that the phrase didn't appear suddenly whole and born out of the sea. So in my quest to locate an origin story for digital rhetoric, the interview with the emeritus UCLA professor widely credited with coining the term was largely worthless and unusable for the purposes of the book. Lanham spent more time reminiscing about the challenges of getting computer hardware into humanities offices back in those days than he did about the nascent scholarly communities of the computers and writing conferences, multimodal publishing ventures, and groups of rhetoricians making forays into what was then called humanities computing rather than digital humanities. I particularly remember how he noticed that UCLA offices with computers also were inevitably equipped with other niceties, such as carpeting, and how reluctant his institution was to provide the humanities as well as it did STEM. However, to provision the humanities as well as it did STEM, and how pleased he was to finally earn his carpeting when he got his computer. At the time, Lanham's response seemed totally bizarre to me. He wasn't answering my most basic questions about the term digital rhetoric. But recently, I've been doing research for a book that I'm tentatively calling Silicon Beach, which asks what happens when the standard Silicon Valley story of innovation around computational media gets told with a focus on the rhetorics of Southern California rather than Northern California. So I've been spending some time in the archives of places like RAND and UCLA. So reading the papers of UCLA Provost Clarence Dykstra, who fought to found a federally funded computing center, the Institute of Numerical Analysis, in the 1940s on his campus, with the help of an unsung heroine in the history of computing, Nina Reese. So forget about Grace Hopper, Nina Reese is my heroine. And despite the existence of rival proposals from Stanford and Berkeley, I am struck by how much of his UCLA correspondence is devoted to things other than the $300,000 IBM digital computer that he was struggling to acquire, like the choice of Venetian blinds for the computing center, or the location of the hot plate to be used by workers during lunch breaks. Like Dykstra actually had like little diagrams in his correspondence, like he was obsessing about where this hot plate would go. Like Lanham's carpeting, Venetian blinds, and hot plates seemed extraneous to the rhetorical scene of digital activity. However, they aren't extraneous if we are to accept the principles of feminist scholarship about technology that draw attention to its material, embodied, affective, labor-intensive, and situated character. Drawing on work in science and technology studies, STS, and human-computer interactions, HCI, as well as interventions by artists and activists in media arts practice, FemTechNet raises questions about instrumentalist narratives in which mastery of the neoliberal human agent over the tool takes center stage. So to give you a sense of some of the theoretical touchstones for FemTechNet, it's the argument that technology is material, although it's often presented as virtual, that technology involves embodiment, although it's often presented as disembodied. Technology solicits affect, although it's often presented as highly rational. It requires labor, although it's often presented as labor-saving. It's situated in particular contexts, although it's often presented as universal. And I will use the acronym NEALS to explain this part of what we do when we think about technology. And it promotes particular values, although it's often presented as neutral. And of course, a lot of this work is work done by rhetoricians as well. I might go even farther with this to suggest that we should have symposia on analog rhetorics that are devoted to attention to material culture and manual labor and computing and communication infrastructures, with papers that might analyze the activity of operators who are often written out of history. For example, take a look at this woman running a coverage machine, simulating bombing runs as a rhetorical actor. Or these prisoners of war from the Spanish-American War, working for the US Signal Corps, laying the military telegraph all across the Philippines at the dawn of the era of global electric communication, which I discovered in the National Archives this summer. However, in this talk, I'm going to look at very recent history, to suggest that attention to how social movements use social media can also offer an opportunity to think about practices and principles in digital rhetoric in new ways. This has implications for the digital humanities as well. In the essay Activism in the Humanities, I make the argument that digital humanities needs to be less divorced from sites of potential conflict with institutional authority and from political activism more generally. Since that time, a number of critics have also drawn attention to how the digital humanities can be more engaged with social movements by designing digital collections with links, comments, maps, timelines, visualizations, multimedia assets, and tools for navigation, search, and aggregation, particularly if working with born digital materials. In this talk, I'd like to think about how scholarship in digital rhetoric could encourage new forms of collaboration with activists, archivists, interface designers, and policymakers, and to explain why digital rhetoric might require fieldwork as well as archival work to support its truth claims. While scholars in post-colonial digital humanities, or DH-POCO, point to the importance of work in non-European languages and traditions, I'm going to focus attention on how English discourse plays an important role in social movements, especially now that more people speak it not as a first language, but as a second, or third, or fourth language. Somewhere between 1 and 1.5 billion people identify as English language users, and thus constitute important aspects of their own agency through Anglophone knowledge. In the spirit of collective research and feminist scholarship, I'd like to acknowledge an important collaborator, Beth Coleman, with whom I've been developing a theoretical framework for talking about the growing relationship between algorithmic culture and social movements, which has included a series of public conversations with others who identify similar concerns, such as Joan Donovan and Vijay Omamel. So during the 2013 demonstrations to protect Istanbul's public green space and to protest the development policies of Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan, this image became popular on North American social media sites as an emblem of urban protest. This assertion that revolution will not be recorded and disseminated, this assertion that revolution will be recorded and disseminated by social media because broadcast media are not up to the task, might also have been translated by those expressing solidarity with dissidents into a statement affirming a causal connection between access to disruptive technologies and disruptive political change. Certainly many US news outlets, especially CNN, have attributed a disproportionate influence to Twitter when covering mass demonstrations in recent years. Unfortunately, the utopian narrative that depicts access to distributed communication networks, combined with the globalization of new US products for short-form, user-friendly mobile communication as inherently liberating for the citizens of the global South, is obviously far too simplistic an explanation for how digital behavior influences social movements and vice versa. In response, a chorus of internet critics have questioned naive ideas about Twitter activism. Malcolm Gladwell, citing Evgeny Morozov, has asserted that the revolution will not be tweeted because participants need to have what he calls skin in the game, as embodied actors willing to assume risk rather than participate indirectly from a distance as clicktivists or slacktivists. Teju Cole has argued that easy-to-like digital media campaigns perpetuate the whole white savior industrial complex, as in the case of the Kony 2012 campaign. Zeynep Tufekci argues that the algorithmic filtering of sites like Facebook obscures results about Ferguson that might not be as sticky, spreadable, and palatable as cat pictures, or as useful for targeted marketing business models. Nonetheless, working across multiple national political contexts, some critics still cherish the hopeful model of collective intelligence being tapped by access to digital technology. For example, Clay Shirky's analysis of the candlelight protests in Korea, the Pink Chadi campaign in India, and the use of ushahidi during election violence in Kenya imagines that technology allows us to tap the resources of cognitive surplus. There does seem to be value to a comparative approach, given the role of English in global activism and the fact of shared protocols in computer-mediated communication. However, Coleman and I argue that lived experience is a lot messier and that local exigencies matter. We assert that the story of tweeting the revolution is always more complex than choreographed political performances of idealized netizens. After all, technology is more than just an amplifier for political behavior. Often participants bring existing practices and norms from digital culture to social movements and sites of activism. In other words, protesters may bring techniques for building community or agitating for disruption learned from participating in game worlds. From participating in game worlds, fan sites, hacker hubs, troll havens, showcases for micro-celebrity or other online environments. For example, many of those gathering in 2008 for enormous anti-US protests against beef imported into Korea and calling for the resignation of the country's president were school-aged candlelight girls. Mimi Ito has argued that the website for the boy band Dongbang Sin-gi, run by their fan club Cassiopeia, became an important platform for organizing the mass demonstrations that eventually brought almost 1 million people into the streets. Similarly, Nishant Shah has described how participants, I lost a slide there. So sad. Okay, similarly, Nishant Shah has argued that members of the supposedly apathetic strawberry generation took over government buildings following scripts learned in the popular game Minecraft. By transposing the activities of exploring hallways, finding empty rooms and barricading themselves against opponents learned online to the real world in the built environment. In the language of new media, Lev Manovich has used the idea of transcoding to explain how computer code shapes the so-called real world by dictating the design of cars, planes, buildings, appliances, furnishings, clothing, and printed matter. If digital environments for gaming, networking, and programming are shaped by the constraints and affordances of particular assemblages of software and hardware too, could we see a similar transcoding into the realms of street activism and mass protest in the built environment of urban landscapes? Coleman and I argue that there can be forms of legitimate peripheral participation online that are structured by the powerful affective ties of co-presence. Those who mock clicktivism or slacktivism as superficial types of engagement may assert